So in the last episode, we talked about how to handle topics with your kids that are up for debate. So things, for example, like the bedtime. You know, you've decided the bedtime is this time. Here's why. Maybe there's a reason to move it later. In this episode, we want to talk about something that I think is a lot more important, which is how to handle things that are not up for debate. For example, specifically as Catholics going to Mass every Sunday. How do you handle when your kids question things like that?
Right. And that's super important because when it comes to the things that are not up for debate, that doesn't mean that you don't talk about them. It does mean that it's really important and we have a direction that we're going. And actually, it's more important that we talk about why that is, why we're heading that direction.
Well, because the downfall to not giving your kids a reason for a decision is that at the point, because the reason that you give when you don't have a discussion is I'm the parent and that's the way it is. So when they turn 18, that no longer is the reason, or that no longer holds any water.
Or if you say I'm the adult and this is how it's going to be. I mean, we say the parent, but you kind of mean I'm the adult. Well, when they become the adult, they're like, well, now I'm the adult and I say something different.
Exactly. And if it's something that all along should have been up for debate, like a bedtime, then the worst case scenario is now they go to bed later. When I moved out of the house, I went from going to bed at 10 o'clock, 10:30 to midnight or 1, and I got to learn that was not a great thing for me and went back to getting up early. But if the thing that they're choosing to reject because you pulled the parent or the adult card is one of the tenets of the Catholic faith, you're in a world of hurt at that point.
Yeah, and I think that there's one of the things that I've said with Strong Catholic Dad is that oftentimes when children reject the faith, they're really rejecting you. And by that, what I'm pointing out is that that the faith. What is the faith? The faith is a belief in God who is love. So it's a belief in love, a belief in loving relationship. And so if that understanding of the faith, being in a loving relationship, meaning that I'm seeking the best self-sacrificially for others, for the other, and they're seeking my best. I mean, that's what the Holy Trinity is all about. So that's the goal of what we're trying to get across with the faith. And there are specific dogmas that we need to understand and abide by, because all of those point back to a loving relationship and they form a loving relationship. So it's like, okay, well, that's great. We need to make sure that they understand that concept of the faith. And when they're rejecting you, what's happening is that like they haven't felt loved. And if they haven't felt loved, then they're going to turn around and say, well, and if this faith has something to do with the rejection that I felt, then I'm rejecting the faith. And it's easier for them to reject the faith than it is for them it's like the proxy war thing. They can reject the faith, which is a way of getting back at you because they're angry. But then there's this second thing that's really important as well, is that when a child rejects the faith, this other part has to do with, well, how was the things that were not negotiable about the faith, how were those talked about? How were they presented? And it's really important that we do talk about why we go to Mass.
Yeah, because in today's culture, I tend to have a melancholic streak to my temperament, which means that I tend to be really all about the rules. And so if you give me a rule, then I'm just going to follow it because that's the rule. And so things like going to Mass every Sunday, making sure you go to confession at least whatever it is once, twice a year, all of these different like precepts of the Catholic Church, I'm going to do them because I was told to do them. But that doesn't hold water in today's culture. I can't use that as a bargaining chip, as an arguing point when I'm talking to other people. And so if your kids just do these things because that's what we're supposed to do, when they get into high school and they have to answer questions to their friends, or when they get into college and they have to answer questions to the professor, or when they get into the work world and the people around them aren't following these precepts, suddenly we do this because this is why we do it doesn't work anymore, and there better be some sort of logic and explanation that went in, underneath that.
Right, and that's not how God does it with us. And I think that that when it comes to parenting, we need to say, well, how does God parent? And I want to bring us to a section of the Catechism that talks about how God parents. And he parents, first of all, and this section is 156. It was really enlightening to me. And it talks about faith and understanding, and they're not separated from each other, like faith and reason. And so the first thing when it comes to why should we believe in God in the first place? Why should we trust the Catholic Church? What moves us to believe is not the fact that revealed truths appear as true and intelligible in the light of our natural reason, which is well, isn't it all about reason? Shouldn't it appeal to it? And it's no, the reason that we believe is because of the authority of God himself, who reveals them, and he can neither deceive nor be deceived. So what the Catechism is telling us at that point is and they're going to address the light of natural reason here in a moment, and the intellect, but they're saying at a base level, just think of a little child who's just born, that they begin to know the loving parent, and because the parent is loving, and because they're reaching out and helping you to survive, that's good enough. That's the starting point. I'm going to trust my parents because they love me and they take care of me. In the same way, I'm going to trust God because he's God, and he made me in the first place. So it's well, that's good enough credentials. You made me, and there's beautiful things around me, and it's okay, so I'm going to trust that you're loving. But then it goes on to say that so that the submission of our faith might nevertheless be in accordance with reason. And a little bit further down it says, so that faith will by no means be a blind impulse of the mind. So this is the good parent God. God willed that external proofs of his revelation should be joined to the internal helps of the Holy Spirit. And so what are these proofs? The miracles of Christ, miraculous things happen. The miracles of the saints, even miracles that are happening today. The prophecies, the church's growth, its holiness, its fruitfulness, its stability. And so one of the things that I find when it comes to the Mass, this was helpful for me to say, well, I believe that going to Mass, that we should do that, and I have several reasons for that. But one of the things that I would often say when I was talking to people on the outside, well, why do you bother doing this? And I was well, and I would jump to, using this line of thinking, to miracles, to talk about the miracle of Lanciano, that there was a priest who wasn't so sure that bread was actually becoming the body and blood of Christ. And so during the consecration, in his hands, as he was consecrating the host, it actually began to bleed in his hands. And so he was somebody who was doubting. And as he saw that, he realized oh my gosh, and he put it down on the paten, and it not only continued to bleed, it became flesh. And it's a Eucharistic miracle, and it's called the miracle of Lanciano. And you can look on the internet today. Anybody can go look and see the flesh encased in glass that's human flesh. And that happened, 400 or 500 years ago. And so those miracles, so for me, having that discussion with my children, what am I doing? I'm giving them things that they can believe in and say, well, that's miraculous. Yeah, it totally is miraculous. And so it's something that is, and that's above our reason, because it doesn't make sense to our reason that bread should turn into flesh. That doesn't make sense. And when we have actual examples of that, then our reason has to say, wow, there are some things that I don't understand, but I see, I see that that's really flesh, and I begin that I need to trust. So when it comes into parenting our kids, this is one of these non-negotiables are some of the things that it's not negotiable to not talk about. We totally need to talk about these, and to be challenged. I remember at some point with you were bringing something up. You were a smart guy, and you were asking me something. I was getting really heated in my response to you, and Maria kind of pulled me aside and said, "Just hold on a second." So she pulled me aside and she said, "Now who's the adult here?" I was "Oh, I don't want to be the adult. I don't want to battle this thing out." And she said, "You're modeling for him how you want him to respond to you. Do you want him to respond the way that you're acting right now?" I was "No, I don't want him to act the way that I'm getting all flustered and angry about it." It's okay, so, and I was "Okay, this is really hard." And she's I didn't say it was going to be easy. Of course it's going to be hard, but how are you going to do that? So then the next step was, and her comment, in wisdom, she said, you need to understand that the way that you're responding to John Andrew and the explanations that you're giving him, he's asking because he's being asked these same things too. He wants to know how to respond to his friends who would make fun of him for believing in the Eucharist. He wants to respond to, know how to respond to a boss or somebody else. The same thing, who's challenging him on his beliefs. So if you enter into it, which just gave me a whole new perspective on how to deal with you and your siblings, is to to deal with it with calmness and say, okay, there is a truth that we can come to. And to talk through what those are. And if you have a good response that I don't know how to answer, that I can say, that's a good point, let me look into that, and not be threatened by it. And I think there was a point in my life where I was threatened. Well, I don't know if this is really true. Well, and if that's the case, then own it. Say well, that's a good point. I'm not so sure about that. Because that's what I want you to say if you're not so sure about something. But then to be able to come back and say, there is room here for me to go back and read more and understand more. And these, and again, the Catechism beautifully points to miracles that have happened throughout the centuries and are even going on now. There was one that happened in Poland about 4 or 5 years ago, a Eucharistic miracle. The bread turned into flesh, and they look at it under a microscope. Actually, I don't think it was the one in South America where they looked at the flesh and they said, "This is living. This is alive flesh. This is crazy." And so what does that do? It also brings us to the third way in which it's important to talk about the non-negotiables, is it brings us to wonder and to awe, because miracles and all of creation bring about awe when we realize the complexity with which things are made, and when we see how much bigger and better ordered things are than we can ever imagine, like on a molecular scale and on a planetary scale. Those things engender awe in us. And then through awe, it's easier to believe that, maybe God can do this crazy thing of making bread into his own flesh.
I heard an argument's the wrong word. I heard an atheist say that the reason that they're not Christian, the reason they don't believe in God, is because when they look at creation, they have this wonder and they have this all, and they want to know why it all happened, and that they're not bound by these just well, it's this way type things. And I'm like, that right there is betrays this terrible misunderstanding of what faith in God is and what the purpose of faith is in the context of the rest of the world, and I love what you're saying about this sense of wonder, because that really is you're coming to know the most amazing being in existence, God, through the way that he put his hand in all of creation. And so science starts unveiling more and more about the creator and more about the way that he thinks. And it actually gives you an opportunity for more wonder, because you're not seeing all of these things as a set of chance. You're seeing the hand of the creator and learning about him through his work. If you with your kids treat faith and treat these non-negotiables as just a set of rules and that's where we are and that's it, then you're engendering within them this mentality about faith that precludes wonder. And we're made for wonder.
Right. Yes. Yeah,
heaven is going to be eternal, the eternal wonder of the presence of God. We're made for that. And if you're cutting that off at the roots by the way that you look at your faith in the first place, your kids are right to reject that, because they're rejecting a lie that's what faith is. Right.
Yeah. And I think for me, it was a big epiphany. I was down in Mexico meeting he was my wife's grandfather. We weren't married at the time, but he was a research scientist. And he had been, and I was thinking, in Mexico, I wonder what his training was. Well, he went to Harvard, and I was like, oh, okay, you're Harvard trained, and he was the assistant for the health department for the country of Mexico. He had actually invented the product that we used before penicillin was made and mass produced. And so this guy has patents after his name, brilliant research scientist. And so I asked him, and I thought, okay, now here I'm dealing with an intellect. He's in Who's, Dr. Leon Lomeli. And so if you look up Dr. Leon, you can find him. And so here's this brilliant person, and a lot of the intelligent people I knew had fallen out of the faith. And so I said, well, as you learn more about about creation and about, I didn't even think I said it this way. I said, as you learn more about science, is what I said at the time. And you begin to understand things more. Does that make you like believe less in God? Because now you know how things work. And he said, oh, no, it is the complete opposite of that. The more that I see the intricacy with which things are created, the more that I believe in the hand of God. Because this is so fearfully and wonderfully made. It's amazing what happens on a molecular level. And so from that, I was like, wow, it struck me that he would have that wonder and awe. And so then it brings us to the next step. It's like, okay, you have to go to Mass. Okay, well, what's have to mean? It's our duty. What's our duty? We always think of our duty as a negative until you think of what Mass is. Mass is the sacrifice of Calvary. And what is Calvary? Calvary is this greatest gift ever. To what? To bring us into eternal relationship with God so that we can enjoy his wonder forever. It's like, oh, well, so what is it? It's like the doorway to heaven. And so what are we doing at Mass? The word Eucharist, Eucharistia in Greek means thanksgiving. So what is our duty? Our duty is we're saying, thank you for your awesomeness. Thank you for your wonder. Thank you that you're going to offer something to us for eternity that's better than we can ever ask or imagine. And as a parent, I totally get this. When I've sacrificed for my child and done good for them and I hand them something good, I want them for themselves to be grateful. Enjoy being grateful. Say thank you. And it's not just because thank you is the right thing to do. Thank you is the right way to be, to be grateful. And that's what the Mass is it's being grateful to God for the amazing gift that he gave us of our faith, of our life, of flowers, of everything that you can imagine, of color, of music, all these great things that are out there are all gifts from him. And so this duty, you look at duty in a negative way instead of this duty of I can't help but want to say thank you, God, for what you've done. And that's a whole different perspective on the Mass than this is something you have to do.
And that knowledge doesn't come from sitting around doing the day-to-day chores and living in society. The underpinning of all of this is, we talked about briefly in the last episode, how parenting isn't just about you passing things on to your kids, it's also your kids training you in a sense. And one of the ways they train you is by asking questions you don't know answers to. You as a human being, God has given you an intellect, and you have an obligation as a human being to become the best version of yourself, to take those talents and not bury them, but use them to increase them multiple times over. You have a responsibility, especially as a parent when it comes to the faith, to continue growing in your faith, because you can't teach your kids what you don't know. And even more deeply, you can't convey to them, pass on to them through all of those kind of moments that you're not planning, something that is not ingrained into your life.
Yes. And I that is such a key point. And it brings up this other aspect of Strong Catholic Dad, where we do the weekly guides for dads. And last night we had done the guide that's called God's Love is Microscopically Penetrating. And it's and the video in there, and actually, let me just set this up. So we haven't done the Strong Catholic Dad guide for the last 3 weeks because things have happened, and we did this other program for one of the weeks, and then it was busy and crazy, and so I was like, gosh, I need to get to it, and Maria was really supportive. She's like, yeah, I'll help set you up for that. And I was like, okay, thank you. So, but none of the kids were they're like, oh gosh, dude. And I got the litany from the older ones of well, okay, I've got to get this other schoolwork done. And is this going to just be 15 to 20 minutes, or is this going to be a little longer version? Cause so it was all of these complaints. I was thinking, oh man, I'm coming into this and it's going to be tough. And so then we sat down, I said, well, there's only one video in this one. And then there's questions at the end. And the video was of the inner life of a human cell, and it used all this word we didn't even know what they were saying. They were using words I have never heard before, and it looks like another planet with all of these different particles working together. And there's this column that literally they talk about these microtubules that are formed by proteins, and they form together and they create this tube in the middle of the cell. And then along this tube, this long stringy thing with looks like feet starts walking up the tube, and it's carrying this big payload behind it, and it's carrying it to the outer edge of the cell wall. And the kids are like going, like, what is this again? This is one human cell? Like, yeah. And as they describe for 7 minutes, all the different activities that's happening, and the DNA and the replication that's happening, and like all of this movement, we're just stunned. And it's beautiful because it's colorful, and they made different colors for the different parts. And then at the end of it, so here, these kids who didn't want to sit down and spend the time are saying, well, that's pretty cool. And I was like, well, yeah, I thought it was pretty cool too. And it's like, what did you learn about the inner life of a cell? And they're like, well, we can't pronounce what happens in there. It's like, no, no, we can't. But then they went further, and they're just saying like, gosh, how many different activities were happening there. Like there was a lot that was going on left and right, and things breaking down and then reforming. It's like, yeah, there is. And like, what does this tell you about God? And they were saying, wow, like God is doing things well beyond I can ever imagine. And it's just like, yeah. And then a little Mercedes said, like, how many cells are in? Oh, actually, I think, first of all, Vivian said, so like one of those little cells, like when I scratch like that, it could fall down and all that stuff's going on in there. Like, yeah, it's like, that's gross. It's like, okay. Yeah, that's what's in a cell. And then Mercedes said, how many cells are there in our body? And that was one of the questions in there. And so then we talked about, like, there are 37 trillion, how many zeros is trillion? It's 12 zeros. It's like there are 37 trillion cells in your body that are all living like that. And in order for you to live, they have to not only do their activity themselves, they have to do that in conjunction with the other cells so that you don't die. Like you'd have to have this orchestra in unison. And so they were enthralled with that, as was I. And then the end of the lesson, it was like, well, if God can make all of this work, I'm like, and actually, I think it was Genevieve who said, like, I don't even think about like making my cells do that. Even moving my finger, like I don't think about moving my finger. I just move it. And she said, I read in my science, all of the pathways that are going between my brain and my finger to make it move exactly where it needs to do. It's like, she's like, it must be going really quickly, back and forth so that I can move and think and eat and all these things. And most of the stuff that goes on in my body, like I'm not even thinking about, and it's all happening and working perfectly. And I was just listening to her saying that going, yeah, like, isn't that amazing? And they're like, yeah, that is amazing. And you could see that there was a delight that was happening in them from seeing what the awe of creation, the wonder of how God made one cell. And so the end of that lesson was really cool, because then the last question is, okay, if you think that God can orchestrate all that activity within one human cell, and then orchestrate all the human cells to make you, and to make you be able to live and function and create and love and do all these amazing things. Don't you think that he could organize your life? Don't you think that that his will might be worth following, and that he's got more under control than you can ever imagine? And they all just like, yeah. Like, I guess I can trust God, because he can do this. He can take care of my life is nowhere near as complicated as one human cell. So I use that as an example to say, that first of all, as parenting, it's hard. It's hard to pull the kids in and to enter into a conversation. But when we got into that conversation and there was that awe, that was a faith lesson. It was easier to believe in God after seeing something that was almost impossible to believe, but we're being told it's true. Look under an electron microscope, and like all this stuff is happening. And so if that's the case, and God can do all that, then he can take care of us. He can love us. Like, yes, he can.
This also brings up something that we kind of haven't touched on in this whole discussion about what's open for debate, what's not, which is that sometimes some of these questions need to be addressed before they become questions. So maybe the 6-year-old or 7-year-old asks, why do we have to go to mass every Sunday? Maybe if they're more like me, they kind of just roll with it. And it's not until they're in high school where somebody starts questioning that they like suddenly have the questions. And so if you as a parent are not taking the deliberate time to speak about faith and to show that your faith is intertwined with your reason, and your faith and reason are intertwined with a sense of wonder, then you're missing out on an opportunity to kind of like lay those layers of foundation to help your child mature from the blind faith of a child whose reason has not fully formed into the kind of the more well-formed faith of a older child, a young adult.
Right. And for sure, they're going to be formed by someone and something. It's like, it's going to happen. And so
this is actually something that blew my mind at one point. I was praying with the better part from Father Bartunik, and it was talking about, I don't remember the exact verse, but it was basically where Jesus says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And it blew my mind because if you think of a human being as being dough, the only way dough turns into bread is through some sort of leaven. And there's this idea in society that you shouldn't indoctrinate your children. You should let them decide what they're going to believe. And it's like, no, they're going to either believe in the truth and take the truths of the faith and integrate them into their lives, or they're going to take the lies of the world and use that as the leaven which helps them grow. And you as a parent have a responsibility to help them choose the right of those two things. And case in point, my pastor back in Indianapolis, Father Nagel, told this story about how he was raised Catholic and ended up leaving the faith when he was 18 or 19. And people would ask him, like, how did you feel about the fact your parents basically forced you to be Catholic? Especially given that you left the faith once you left the home. And what he said, which I will never forget, was, my parents gave me contrast. They gave me a cohesive way of living my life. They enforced that in the house. They explained why. And I chose to reject it. But I could always ask myself, once I had rejected it, am I happier now than I was then? And am I happier now than my parents are? Am I happier than these people who've accepted the faith? And ultimately, a couple years after leaving the faith, he realized, I'm not happier now. And he came back to the faith and ended up becoming a priest. So that responsibility is even if you do everything right, even if you're giving the reasons and then you're giving them a sense of wonder, even if they choose to reject it, you've still fulfilled your responsibility and given them something that they can balance the rest of their life against.
Right. And I would say, in addition to that, there's that whole question of like, okay, this is contrast. And what's the contrast? You pointed right to happiness. And I think, well, this goes back into the fruits of the Holy Spirit. Like, is there joy? Is there peace? And I think is there love? And you look at those three top ones and realize, wow, is there gentleness? Is there gratitude? Like, you look at all the fruits of the Holy Spirit, and those are all things that like we want. Like, I want self-control, I want faithfulness, I want those things, and most of all, I want peace, and I want joy, and I want love. And so I think that's one of the back to your point of like, I need to be striving for this, to live the faith as well, to understand the faith as well, and to find, through Christ, through the church, through the Eucharist, through God, love, peace, and joy. And if I'm finding those things, my kids know that. They know what's true. They know if I'm being an imposter or if I'm more joyful through this faithfulness that I've committed to. Am I more gentle? Am I more approachable? And so living that, first of all, me seeking after that, and then for them to see that's why it's not negotiable to when it comes to practicing the faith, because the fruit of it is joy, peace, and love. And it's like, and that's totally what I want. And if I'm living that, it's going to be attracted to them, and they're going to want it too. And they're going to want to find out, well, how do you get to it? And so, back to your point, really well made in the beginning, is that it's one of the most important things to do is to enter into discussion about the non-negotiables as we're struggling with them too. There's times where it's like, gosh, I don't want to get up and go to Mass, but what's the fruit of that? And I have examples where I've told the kids where it happened again this morning. Like, I woke up and I was struggling as I went into morning prayer. And like the first, the second, the third line were scripture verses I have read before and have been important to me for the last 20 years. And they were right there in a row, three of my favorites right in a row. And they were all pointing me to trusting. It's like, you need to trust right now. Like, there's a darkness that's kind of coming over you. And like, I've got this, all taken care of. And I relaxed and I felt peace. And that's one of the fruits. It's like, thank you, because I wasn't feeling peace when I entered into this prayer time. And that's something I want to communicate to my kids, is to tell them, you will find peace, you will find joy, you will find love when you follow what the church has asked us to do. That's all we have time for today. If you like what you've heard on the podcast, please subscribe, leave a 5-star review, and encourage your friends and family to do the same. If you want to support the work of Strong Catholic Dad, you can become a monthly sponsor for as little as $5 a month. I quit my job back in 2018 to found Strong Catholic Dad, and as of right now, it's not enough to pay the bills. So anything that you can do is appreciated. Until next time, be strong in faith, strong in hope, and strong in love. God bless.